basic details is the Houthi movement has widespread support inside Yemen and has created a government in the north that governs 80% of the population. So they are essentially the government of Yemen, but they're not the internationally recognized government. And the US and Saudi Arabia have spent 2 years trying to restore the puppet government in the south that is going to be compliant to Western demands, that is going to allow Western oil corporations and companies to send trade off of the southwest border. The southwest of Yemen is very strategically important near the Red Sea there, and there's something called the Mandab Strait, or the Bab al-Mandab, where every single day 3 to 4 million barrels of oil travels through, along with important ships for trade of other goods. So this is a very strategically important region. Yemen does not really have natural resources like Saudi Arabia does. It doesn't have large oil reserves, but it's a strategically located country in the region. And then, of course, Saudi Arabia and the US are trying to do whatever they can to prevent another country in the region from emerging that exercises any kind of independent foreign policy, as Syria did, as Libya did, and that especially has some kind of close relations with Iran. So again, I know that's a lot of context there, and it's a lot to wrap your head around, but the point is that despite media outlets constantly calling this a proxy war, for instance, Vox here in the US expressly said recently in a video, they said Yemen is a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. That is blatantly false. I mean, that is propaganda that has been spread by the US and Saudi Arabia, because of course the US accuses anyone who it wants to overthrow of being a tool of Iran, a supporter of Hezbollah, etc. That helps them justify military aggression. And of course this war has left thousands and thousands of civilians dead, and has left millions on the verge of famine. And inside Yemen now, thanks to this war, we have the largest humanitarian crisis in the world. The largest in the world. And again, when we're talking about media coverage, we frequently hear about Syria, which is important because Syria is also a horrific crisis, although the media reporting on that is even worse. But when we hear about Syria all the time, of course, that is usually in media reports, those reflect the atrocities committed by U.S. enemies, by Western enemies, namely the Syrian government, Iran, Russia. What we don't hear about, of course, is the atrocities committed by the U.S., by its proxies, by Saudi Arabia. Well, this is also somewhat true for the conflict in Yemen. And there has been very inadequate reporting on this conflict where it's very clear, there is no question, the U.S.-Saudi coalition is responsible for the majority of the civilian casualties. They've killed thousands of civilians in the bombing campaign, and especially thanks to disease and hunger. And Yemen is the poorest country in the Middle East, being bombed by one of the richest, Saudi Arabia, which is the largest oil exporter in the world. And now Yemen has been suffering from the worst cholera outbreak in history, in recorded history. So records for cholera began in 1949. Since 1949, there has been no worse cholera outbreak than the one in Yemen. And cholera has been eradicated in the West. This is not a disease that's a problem here in the US or in Australia or in the UK, in Europe. But in Yemen, where the disease had nearly been eradicated before the conflict, there now have been nearly 500,000 cases since late April, about 450,000 cases, and they're still growing. And this is actually worse than Haiti in 2011, after the horrific earthquake there. There was an outbreak of cholera. So we're talking catastrophic levels. In 3 months, Yemen has had more cholera cases than Haiti had in the entire year of 2011. At least 2,000 people have died. And that is, of course, in addition to all the children who have died from preventable diseases, from hunger, and from other causes. UNICEF estimated that in 2016 alone, 63,000 children died in Yemen from preventable causes thanks to this war. 63,000 children. And again, we hear nothing. We hear no media reports. We hear constantly of Syria, where unfortunately hundreds of thousands of people have died. It's horrific. But then we hear nothing about Yemen, where the U.S. is directly responsible for fueling a war that last year alone led to the deaths of 63,000 children because of preventable causes.
Yeah, that's just like amazing, isn't it? That and the media the mainstream media to be so on page with the establishment that they just know what not to talk about and what I mean. It's truly amazing. And wasn't it the UN? They decided not to supply the cholera vaccine. Is that right?
Yeah.
They said, and if you could talk a little bit about that. Oh,
yeah,
and
I mean,
whatever else you want to talk about in that.
This is something that the UN certainly should be. I like this comment here. Capitalists have lost their morals. That's certainly true. I would say they never really had morals, but that's not. The system doesn't allow that. But the World Health Organization, they deserve criticism for this. However, it should be put in a larger context. The World Health Organization announced a few weeks ago that they're ending their cholera vaccination campaign inside Yemen for two reasons. One, because they simply could not access much of the country due to the war. And I mentioned, I did an overview of the war, but what's even less mentioned is that the U.S. Navy is helping Saudi Arabia enforce a crippling blockade on Yemen, which is similar in many ways to the blockade being imposed on Gaza for 10 years now. Well, there's been a crippling blockade on Yemen that has prevented food, humanitarian supplies, water, fuel from entering the country. And this is a country where 90% of the food before the conflict had been imported, so not only has the war fueled hunger, which again, like I said, has led to mass death and pushed millions of Yemenis onto the brink of famine. But not only that, the blockade has really prevented food from coming in and exacerbated the hunger. And human rights organizations have expressly said that hunger is being used as a weapon in Yemen. But in addition to that, the World Health Organization announced that it's going to be ending its vaccination campaign because they simply can't get access to many of the parts of Yemen that are afflicted by cholera, because they're being bombed and attacked by the U.S.-Saudi coalition, because there's fighting going on between the Houthis and the Saudi coalition. Also, another factor that's related to it is they simply don't have funding. Repeatedly, the UN has tried to raise money to support Yemen, and repeatedly, they don't even get more than 1/4 of the requested funding. There are a variety of reasons for that. There are other conflicts going on, the war in Syria. Yemen is simply not on the radar, even though, again, as I stressed, this is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world that has been created by a UK-backed war. It's even worse in Syria, but it doesn't get any attention. It doesn't get the funding it needs. And also, the U.S. under Trump is boasting of how it's cutting funding for international aid institutions in the United Nations. In fact, Nikki Haley, who is the ultra-right-wing U.S. ambassador to the UN, she boasted that the U.S. was cutting millions of dollars in funding. She literally bragged about it. So the World Health Organization ended its program, and they said that we're going to spend the little money we have trying to fight hunger in Yemen, and not hunger and cholera, because they said cholera is basically, at this point, they can treat it, but they can't really prevent it anymore.
Oh, really? God.
Yeah,
because
it's hell
that's
on
just
earth.
going to, because that's just going to rip through the population, and I don't know. Could you call this an intentional ethnic cleansing by Saudi Arabia? Like, is this would you or is that too extreme?
Well, ethnic cleansing is a very specific meaning. I wouldn't necessarily say it's ethnic cleansing, because that's what, like, for instance, the Israeli government has done inside Palestine, where you are displacing one ethnic population, namely the Palestinians, and replacing them with Israeli settlers. That is ethnic cleansing. In Yemen, it's different. It's not like Saudi settlers are trying to take over the country. I think you could argue that it's borderline genocidal. It's borderline genocidal. In the sense that, Saudi Arabia isn't necessarily trying to kill every single Yemeni, but they're using genocidal tactics, namely starvation, mass starvation, in order to force the population to essentially concede to whatever puppet government is being imposed on them. And again, they're using hunger as a weapon, and they're relentlessly bombing civilian infrastructure. And again, they're doing this with staunch American and British support. The coalition, in media reports, they commonly use the phrase Saudi-led coalition. And that is true. The coalition is Saudi-led. However, although the bombers are themselves Saudi, the planes they're flying are not Saudi. The planes they're flying are American and British. The fuel in the planes is American and British. The weapons they're using are American and British, including cluster bombs, which are banned by more than 100 countries. U.S. and UK-made cluster bombs have been dropped on civilian areas inside Yemen. They're also using military assistance from the American and British militaries who have physically been in the command room with the Saudi military. So this is, again, I use the phrase U.S. hyphen or U.S./Saudi war, because this is not, it is technically Saudi-led on paper, but without American and British support, this conflict would never be able to go on. The war would be over, which is also true for other wars like the war in Syria. But the only reason Saudi Arabia is allowed to continue bombing Yemen, politically, militarily, economically, is because of its support from Western countries. And that's why, not just Americans, but especially Americans, that's why we are directly complicit. Our tax dollars are going to fund the mass killing through actual war, but also through starvation, also through the spread of diseases of Yemenis. And this is blood on our hands.